What if everything you believed about losing your potbelly is completely wrong? Not partially wrong, not a little off, completely, fundamentally, 100% wrong. Right now, millions of people are showing up to the gym every single day. They are lifting weights, building muscle, getting stronger every week, and yet that stubborn, protruding belly is not going anywhere. It just sits there, unmoved, unchanged, almost like it's mocking every single effort you make. And here is the most frustrating part about all of this. It is not because those people are lazy or undisciplined or not trying hard enough. It is because they are using the right tool for the wrong problem. They are solving something they don't fully understand yet. And that changes today. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something important. This is not an attack on resistance training or lifting weights at all. I lift weights. I believe in lifting weights. The research behind resistance training for overall health, longevity, and metabolism is genuinely rock solid and undeniable. But when we zoom in on one very specific problem, visceral fat, the science starts telling a completely different story than most people expect. And once you understand that story, you are going to stop training hard and start training smart. There is a massive difference between those two things. So let's go back to the very beginning and actually understand what we are dealing with here before we talk about solutions. Most people see a potbelly and assume it is just regular fat sitting underneath the skin. They think if they burn enough calories, it will shrink down and disappear. That is partially true, but it is missing the deeper layer, the layer that is actually driving that rounded, protruding belly shape from the inside. That deeper layer is called visceral fat. And visceral fat is not the same as the fat you can grab with your fingers on the outside. Visceral fat lives deep inside your abdominal cavity. It sits in what is called the peritoneal space, which is essentially the interior chamber that houses all your organs. It wraps itself directly around your liver, your intestines, your pancreas. It is internal. It is deep, and you cannot feel it from the outside at all. When visceral fat accumulates over time, it physically pushes outward against your abdominal wall. It inflates your midsection from the inside like pressure building inside a balloon. This is why some people look like they have enormous amounts of belly fat when they actually don't have that much subcutaneous fat at all. The visceral fat underneath is doing the distorting. But the real reason this matters goes far beyond appearance. Visceral fat is one of the most metabolically active and dangerous fat deposits in the entire human body. Research has directly linked high visceral fat levels to elevated white blood cell counts. It raises C-reactive protein, which is one of the most reliable markers of chronic systemic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is not something to take lightly. It quietly disrupts your insulin sensitivity, your blood glucose regulation, your energy metabolism, and essentially every system your body relies on daily. The more visceral fat you carry, the harder your body works just to function at a basic level. And over time, that constant strain compounds into serious long-term consequences. So when we talk about reducing a potbelly, we are not talking about vanity. We are talking about reducing inflammation, restoring metabolic health, and protecting your body from the inside out. Now that we understand what we are actually dealing with, let's talk about why the most popular solution is actually the wrong one for this specific problem. The fitness world right now is completely obsessed with resistance training, and again, for good reason. Building muscle increases your resting metabolic rate significantly over time. Muscle tissue is metabolically expensive. It burns calories even at rest. It improves your body's ability to absorb and use glucose from the bloodstream after every meal. The long-term benefits of resistance training for overall metabolic health are genuinely hard to overstate. It is one of the best things you can do for your body across a lifetime. But here is where the disconnect happens. A major review published in the journal Obesity Reviews analyzed 35 separate peer-reviewed research papers specifically examining resistance training and visceral fat. 35 studies. That is not a small sample. That is a substantial, comprehensive body of research pointing in a very clear direction. And the conclusion across all 35 of those papers was consistent. Resistance training did not produce a meaningful, measurable reduction in visceral fat levels. Let that land for a moment. You could be showing up, lifting heavy, pushing yourself hard every single week, and the visceral fat is essentially sitting there completely unbothered. Some of those studies went even further. They looked at whether combining resistance training with aerobic exercise would make a difference for visceral fat reduction specifically. The answer was still no. Adding resistance training on top of cardio did not produce any additional benefit when it came specifically to visceral fat. The cardio alone was doing the work. So if resistance training is not the answer for visceral fat, what actually is? And why does it work when lifting weights simply does not? The answer is aerobic exercise, cardio. And before you close this out thinking you already knew that, stay with me, because the details here are everything. Not all cardio works the same way. Not all cardio produces the same hormonal response, and not all cardio targets visceral fat with the same level of precision and effectiveness. The research published in the Journal of Physiology found something very specific and very important. Shorter, higher-intensity bouts of cardio were significantly more effective at reducing visceral fat than longer, moderate-intensity sessions. This is not just about burning more calories in less time, although that is certainly part of it. The real reason runs much deeper than simple caloric expenditure alone. When you push your body through a short, explosive, maximum effort, a hard sprint, a fast cycling interval, a powerful rowing push, something specific happens hormonally. Your body triggers a significant spike in human growth hormone. And that hormonal spike activates an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase inside your fat tissue. Hormone-sensitive lipase promotes lipolysis. Lipolysis is the biological process of breaking stored fat down into free fatty acids that your body can actually use as fuel. So you are not just burning calories during the workout itself, you are triggering a hormonal cascade that continues breaking down stored fat long after the workout is completely over. That is a fundamentally different mechanism than what happens during steady, moderate intensity cardio. And it explains a large part of why the intensity level matters so much here. But there is one more layer to this. One that specifically explains why visceral fat responds so powerfully to high-intensity work in a way that other fat deposits do not quite match. Inside visceral fat tissue, there is a higher concentration of something called glucocorticoid receptors compared to subcutaneous fat sitting just under the skin. Glucocorticoid receptors are directly responsive to cortisol. Cortisol is your body's primary stress hormone, and it plays a much more complex role than most people realize or give it credit for. Most people have heard that cortisol is bad. That chronic stress raises cortisol and causes fat gain, particularly around the belly area. And that part is absolutely true and well supported. When cortisol is chronically elevated from ongoing psychological stress, poor sleep, or overtraining, and you are sedentary or in a caloric surplus, those glucocorticoid receptors tell your body to store more fat viscerally. But here is the side of cortisol that almost nobody talks about. When cortisol spikes acutely during intense physical exercise and your body is in a state of high energy demand, the behavior flips completely. Instead of promoting visceral fat storage, those same glucocorticoid receptors begin promoting fat mobilization. They help pull fat out of the visceral tissue to be burned as fuel for the effort you are putting in. This is the key mechanism that makes high-intensity interval training so uniquely effective for visceral fat specifically. You spike cortisol through intense effort while simultaneously creating massive energy demand. The hormonal environment flips from storage mode into burning mode. And because visceral fat has more of those cortisol responsive receptors than subcutaneous fat does, it gets targeted preferentially. This is not a theory. This is the biology of your own body, working exactly the way it was designed to work when you give it the right stimulus at the right intensity. Now let's make this completely practical, because understanding the mechanism is important, but knowing exactly how to apply it is what actually produces results in real life. High-intensity interval training is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the entire fitness space. Most people hear the words high intensity and immediately imagine something brutal and unsustainable. They picture running at 80% of maximum heart rate for 20 straight minutes, completely destroyed, gasping for air, dragging themselves off the treadmill afterward. That is not HIIT. That is just hard cardio. True high-intensity interval training is built entirely around one core principle: maximum effort for a short burst, followed by complete and total recovery before you go again. Here is what that actually looks like in practice. You pick your cardio method: sprinting outdoors, cycling on a stationary bike, rowing, or even a steep hill. The modality matters less than the effort level. You go as hard as you genuinely can for 20 to 30 seconds. Not 70% effort, not a strong jog. Absolute maximum output for that short window of time. Then you stop completely. You walk. You breathe. You let your heart rate come back down and your body recover fully before the next interval begins. For some people, full recovery takes 60 seconds. For others, it takes 90 seconds or 2 to 3 minutes, depending on fitness level. That is completely fine and completely normal. Do not rush the recovery to squeeze in more intervals. That is the single most common mistake people make with HIIT, and it completely destroys the effectiveness of the entire session. When you cut the recovery short, you prevent your body from reaching true maximum effort on the next interval. You turn it into moderate, sustained cardio and lose the hormonal benefits entirely. Sprint. Fully recover. Sprint again. That cycle repeated for 15 to 20 total minutes is genuinely all you need to start producing real results with visceral fat. Think of it exactly the same way you think about heavy lifting. You would never skip your rest between heavy sets of squats because you know the rest is what allows full effort on the next set. HIIT is identical in that structure. The intervals are your heavy sets. The recovery periods are your mandatory rest. Both halves of that equation are equally important to the outcome. Now, does this mean that slower, steady-state cardio has no value? Absolutely not. Zone 2 cardio has a legitimate and important role in this entire framework. Moderate intensity aerobic work, a brisk walk, a light jog, a comfortable bike ride where you could still hold a conversation, does meaningfully contribute to visceral fat reduction over time. It works through a simpler mechanism than HIIT, primarily through consistent caloric expenditure and gradual cardiovascular improvements that compound positively over weeks and months. And for many people, Zone 2 cardio is far more sustainable as a consistent daily habit than high-intensity interval work, which genuinely demands more from your body and requires more recovery time between sessions. 2 to 3 days per week of 15 to 30 minutes of easy Zone 2 cardio is the perfect complement to your HIIT sessions. Walk with purpose. Jog lightly. Ride at a steady, comfortable pace. You are building your aerobic base, protecting your heart, contributing to your daily energy balance, and keeping your visceral fat moving steadily in the right direction over time. Now let's come back to resistance training and place it properly inside this framework, because it absolutely belongs here, just in a different role than most people assigned it. Resistance training does not directly reduce visceral fat. The research has made that very clear across dozens of studies. But calling it unimportant would be one of the biggest mistakes you could make. What resistance training does is improve your body's ability to manage glucose and energy in a way that directly prevents visceral fat from accumulating in the first place. When you build and maintain meaningful muscle mass, those muscle fibers become more sensitive to insulin. They pull glucose out of your bloodstream more efficiently and more completely after every single meal. That means your blood sugar spikes less after eating. Your insulin levels rise less dramatically and come back down more quickly. The entire hormonal environment shifts away from fat storage mode. Chronically elevated blood sugar and insulin are two of the most powerful drivers of visceral fat accumulation. Resistance training directly addresses both of those drivers at the root level. So while it does not burn visceral fat that is already there, it creates the metabolic conditions that make it significantly harder for new visceral fat to accumulate going forward. That is enormously valuable. Think of resistance training as the protective foundation of the entire system. HIIT burns what is already there. Resistance training prevents more from coming back. Both roles are essential and non-negotiable. 2 to 5 days per week of full-body resistance training is the foundation. Non-negotiable. Not because it melts visceral fat, but because it protects everything you work to build through cardio. Now let's put the entire framework together clearly, simply, and in a way you can actually start applying this week without confusion or overwhelm or needing to completely rebuild your routine. 2 to 5 days per week of full-body resistance training. This is your metabolic foundation. It protects your insulin sensitivity, maintains muscle mass, and keeps your glucose metabolism functioning properly. 2 to 3 days per week of Zone 2 cardio for 15 to 30 minutes. Walking, light jogging, easy cycling, conversational pace. Consistent effort. This keeps your caloric balance and cardiovascular health moving in the right direction. 2 to 3 days per week of true high-intensity interval training for 15 to 20 minutes. Short, explosive bursts. Full, honest recovery between each interval. Maximum effort every single time you go. Ideally, stack your HIIT sessions on the same days as your resistance training. This keeps your recovery days genuinely restful and gives your body the time it needs to adapt and improve between sessions. None of these three elements alone will solve the problem completely. Each one is solving a different piece of the same puzzle, and the puzzle only comes together when all three pieces are in place simultaneously. Resistance training builds the metabolic foundation that prevents future accumulation. Zone 2 cardio supports cardiovascular health and overall energy balance day to day consistently. And HIIT does the specific, targeted, hormonally driven work of hitting visceral fat directly where it lives, using the very biological mechanisms that make your body uniquely capable of burning it efficiently. You do not need to spend 2 hours in the gym every day. You do not need to destroy yourself on a treadmill 6 days a week. You do not need to choose between building muscle and losing visceral fat. You need all three tools working together. You need to understand what each one actually does inside your body. And you need to trust the process long enough for the biology to work in your favor. Most people fail at this not because they lack discipline or motivation. They fail because they pick one tool and hammer it relentlessly while wondering why the results are not coming. Now you understand why. Now you know exactly what the research says, what the biology does, and what your weekly training structure needs to look like to address this problem properly and permanently. The visceral fat that is making your belly protrude, driving your inflammation higher, and quietly damaging your metabolic health, it is not unbeatable. It is just misunderstood. And now that you understand it, you have everything you need to go after it intelligently, systematically, and with the full power of the biology working with you instead of against you. Because that is really what this comes down to in the end. Stop fighting your body. Start understanding it. And then give it exactly what the science says it needs to change.